a homeless violinist, a lonely millionaire, and a cat with a mysterious gaze. What seemed like just another cold night at a subway entrance turns into a tale of twists, lies, and revelations about a past neither of them expected to confront. But can music truly save a life? Henry Caldwell had everything money could buy, except a sense of fulfillment. A millionaire since his 30s, he had earned respect in the world of architecture with his sophisticated and minimalist designs. But inside his luxurious apartment, loneliness was a constant companion. His days were filled with meetings, contracts, and an obsession with perfection, while the rest of the world felt distant, almost untouchable. Everything in his life was meticulously controlled, except for the emptiness that refused to leave. On the other hand, Sarah Bennett had no luxury at all, but she possessed something Henry's money couldn't buy: resilience. Kicked out of her home by an abusive ex-partner, she faced freezing nights clinging to the only loyal companion she had left, Jasper, her cat. During the day, she played her violin on the streets, her music echoing the dreams and warmth she had once known. Each note was a way to soothe her soul and gather just enough to survive another day. That night, their worlds were about to collide. Henry was walking past the subway station, his mind occupied with thoughts about his next high-profile project. Meanwhile, Sarah fought against the biting wind, her trembling fingers gliding over her violin strings. Beside her, Jasper snuggled into a worn-out blanket, trying to stay warm. The music she played wasn't just a melody, it was a silent cry for help. Henry stopped in his tracks. The sound of the violin seemed to resonate in a forgotten corner of his soul, a place he hadn't realized existed. He turned toward the source of the music and found Sarah hunched over her instrument. The scene was surreal, a sublime melody emerging from such a harsh, desolate setting. He hesitated as if standing at a crossroads, unsure of what to do. Jasper lifted his head, his green eyes locking onto Henry's. There was something in that gaze that made him pause. Henry wasn't one for sentimentality, but the combination of the music, Sarah's vulnerability, and the cat's quiet determination struck a chord he didn't understand. He thought about walking away, ignoring the scene as he had with so many other things. But something held him back. Sarah, unaware of Henry's attention, continued to play. Her violin was more than an instrument, it was a lifeline to a world where she still believed in possibilities. Each note carried a story, a memory. It was the only way she could feel alive amid the chaos. Henry stood there, his thoughts spinning out of control. He remembered his own early struggles, back when success seemed like a distant dream. Was it possible that he, with all his money and comfort, had more in common with this violinist than he cared to admit? Jasper stretched and meowed, breaking the uncomfortable silence that surrounded Henry. He took a step forward and then stopped. His rational mind told him to move on, that this wasn't his problem. But that soft meow, and perhaps something deeper, pulled him back. Henry felt a pressure in his chest, as though he knew this decision was more significant than it seemed. As Sarah's final note lingered in the cold air, Henry was still frozen in place, caught between his instincts and his logic. He wasn't one to take emotional risks. But in that moment, as he looked at Sarah and Jasper, a voice inside whispered that maybe this was his chance, not just to change their lives, but to change his own. Henry lingered, frozen, as the final notes of Sarah's violin drifted into the cold night air. He couldn't quite explain why he couldn't just walk away. Perhaps it was the stark contrast, the delicacy of the music against the harshness of her reality. He watched as Sarah carefully tucked her violin into its worn case, while Jasper, restless, shifted under the fraying blanket. The scene carried an unspoken urgency that Henry couldn't ignore. "Excuse me," he heard himself say before he could think it through. Sarah glanced up, startled, clutching the violin case like a shield. Henry hesitated, suddenly aware of how strange this must seem. "You play beautifully," he managed, the words tumbling out too quickly. Her gaze softened slightly, but her grip on the case remained firm. "Thank you," she replied cautiously, her voice guarded but polite. Henry noticed the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders were drawn tight as though bracing for something. He took a step back, trying to show he wasn't a threat. The cold wind howled between them, amplifying the fragile quiet that followed. "Do you need help?" The words slipped out before he could stop them, hesitant, barely audible. It wasn't like him to ask such questions, let alone to strangers. Sarah blinked a few times, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady, though the shiver running through her betrayed her words. Jasper's soft meow broke the awkward silence. Henry glanced at the small cat, and something stirred in his chest. He had never been sentimental, but the way Jasper looked at him, as if pleading silently, tugged at a part of him he didn't fully understand. He sighed, shoving his hands into his pockets to hide his uncertainty. "I can help." "Really?" Sarah lowered her eyes to her violin and then to Jasper. She wasn't sure what he wanted in return. The streets had taught her to be wary, but her intuition told her this man didn't seem dangerous. She looked back up at him. "Why?" she asked, her voice filled with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. Henry paused. He didn't have a clear answer. Maybe it was the music that still lingered in his mind, or Jasper's quiet yet insistent gaze. Maybe it was the resilience in Sarah's expression, despite her circumstances. "Because I can," he said simply, surprising even himself with the honesty in his tone. Sarah hesitated, weighing her options. Accepting help from a stranger could lead to complications she wasn't ready for. "I don't want to be a burden," she murmured, though her voice betrayed the exhaustion she tried to hide. Henry shook his head firmly. "You're not. Just let me help." Her resistance wavered, though uncertainty still clouded her features. Jasper, as if sensing the weight of the decision, leapt into her arms and nuzzled her chin. Sarah glanced at the cat, then back at Henry. Perhaps, just this once, it was safe to accept. "All right," she said softly, her voice tinged with reluctant trust. As Henry led the way down the street, he felt a strange mix of doubt and conviction. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was about to do something meaningful. Sarah, still unsure of his motives, clutched Jasper tightly, a faint flicker of hope sparking in her eyes despite herself. As they walked along the dimly lit sidewalk, Henry felt the weight of his decisions settling heavily on his shoulders. Sarah clutched Jasper in her arms, silent yet watchful, her gaze darting cautiously between Henry and their surroundings. Each step seemed to magnify the unease in his chest. Was this really the right thing to do? He barely knew her, and yet here he was, taking her into his world. When they reached the entrance to his building, Henry hesitated. His pristine apartment had always been a sanctuary, a carefully controlled space where nothing disrupted his solitude. "Wait here for a moment," he said, his voice more abrupt than he intended. Sarah nodded quietly, tightening her grip on Jasper, who let out a small meow as if sensing her unease. Henry climbed the stairs slowly, each step echoing his rising doubts. Inside his apartment, he paused in the doorway, staring at the immaculate space he had spent years curating. It was sterile, minimalistic, and untouched by chaos, the complete opposite of what Sarah and Jasper represented. His hand rested on the doorknob, but he couldn't bring himself to turn it. Questions began to flood his mind. What if Sarah was lying? What if she was taking advantage of his kindness? He had heard stories about con artists and manipulators, and the seeds of doubt took root. He inhaled deeply, his logical side urging him to return downstairs and send her away. But just as he was about to move, the faint echo of her music played in his memory, accompanied by the image of Jasper's quiet, pleading eyes. Reluctantly, Henry made his way back down. Sarah was still standing by the door, her violin case slung over her shoulder and her eyes cast downward. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded. He opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated again. Something in her stance, proud yet vulnerable, stopped him. "You don't have to do this," she said softly, sensing his internal conflict. Henry's breath hitched. "You need a place to stay," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. He was trying to convince himself as much as her. The doubts lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. He had always kept his life tightly controlled. Letting someone like Sarah in felt like an act of surrender to the unknown. As they ascended the stairs together, Henry wrestled with his discomfort. He was acutely aware of how fragile this situation felt, as though it could shatter with one wrong move. Sarah remained quiet, sensing the tension in his every step. When they reached his door, he paused again before finally opening it, revealing the pristine interior beyond. Sarah stepped inside hesitantly, her eyes scanning the apartment. The space was as stark and cold as she imagined it might be, beautiful, yes, but devoid of warmth. Jasper slipped from her arms and began exploring, his curiosity unbothered by the tension between the humans. Sarah glanced back at Henry, her expression unreadable. Henry watched her closely, still unsure if he had made the right choice. Sarah, sensing his unease, moved to a corner of the room and quietly set her violin case down. She didn't say much, but her movements were deliberate, almost as if she were trying to take up as little space as possible. Jasper, meanwhile, jumped onto the couch and curled up, making himself at home. In the stillness of the apartment, Henry felt his doubts grow louder. He had let Sarah and Jasper in, but the real question lingered. Could he let go of the fear that this choice would upend everything he had built? And more importantly, was he ready to trust someone else after years of keeping the world at arm's length? Henry closed the door behind Sarah and leaned against it for a moment, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His apartment was no longer just his. It now held a young woman, her violin, and a curious cat who seemed to have no problem making himself comfortable. For a man so accustomed to solitude, the presence of another person, two if you counted Jasper, felt both unsettling and strangely right. Sarah lingered near the doorway, clutching her worn violin case as her eyes darted around the room. The space was immaculate, with sharp lines and minimalist furniture that exuded wealth and control. It looked more like a museum exhibit than a home, and Sarah felt even more out of place. Jasper, on the other hand, seemed delighted, hopping onto the couch as though it had been made for him. "You must be cold," Henry said suddenly, breaking the silence. He retrieved a blanket from a nearby closet and handed it to her, his movements stiff and awkward. Sarah hesitated for a moment before accepting it, pulling it tightly around her shoulders. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice quiet but sincere. She sank onto the couch, keeping her violin case close by as if it were her lifeline. Henry hovered near the kitchen, unsure of what to do next. He wasn't used to this, offering comfort, making small talk, letting someone into his personal space. After a few moments of internal debate, he began to make tea. It wasn't much, but it gave him something to do, a small gesture to fill the uncomfortable silence. As the tea steeped, Henry's thoughts wandered. He hadn't planned any of this, hadn't intended to bring Sarah and Jasper into his life. But now that they were here, he couldn't ignore the parallels between her struggles and his own early years. He remembered the nights he had spent doubting his abilities, wondering if he'd ever escape the weight of failure. Perhaps this was why he couldn't walk away when he saw her. Sarah, meanwhile, sat quietly, her eyes flickering between Jasper, who had curled up contentedly, and the spotless apartment around her. She wasn't sure how long she would be allowed to stay, but for now, it was a relief to feel warmth again, both physically and emotionally. The silence wasn't oppressive, it was cautious, like both of them were testing the waters. When Henry returned with 2 cups of tea, Sarah accepted hers with a small nod of thanks. "You live alone?" she asked after a few sips, breaking the silence. Henry nodded, his gaze dropping to his cup. "Yeah. It's just easier that way." His words hung in the air, and Sarah didn't push further, though she couldn't help but wonder what easier meant for someone with so much. "Why the violin?" Henry asked, catching her off guard. She looked at him for a moment, as if deciding how much to share. "Because it's the only thing that still makes sense," she finally said, her voice tinged with a quiet sadness. Henry nodded, understanding more than he expected. He knew what it was like to cling to something that gave you purpose when the rest of the world seemed to crumble. As the evening wore on, the tension between them began to ease. They didn't talk much, but the moments of silence grew less heavy. Jasper provided some comic relief, bounding around the apartment and inspecting every corner before settling back on the couch. Henry found himself smiling at the cat's antics, and Sarah noticed a flicker of warmth sparking in her chest. By the time the night drew to a close, Henry had set up the guest room for Sarah. "It's not much, but it's yours for now," he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. Sarah gave him a small smile, clutching the blanket tighter. "It's more than enough," she replied, her voice steady but grateful. As she stepped into the room, Jasper trotted in after her, as if declaring his loyalty to both of them. Henry returned to the living room, sitting on the couch where Jasper had been. For the first time in years, his apartment didn't feel empty. As he stared out the window at the city lights, he couldn't help but wonder if he had just taken the first step towards something greater, something that scared him as much as it intrigued him. Sarah stood in the middle of Henry's apartment, wrapped in the blanket he had given her, her violin case resting at her feet. The space was unlike anything she had ever known, sleek, spotless, and unnervingly quiet. Jasper was already exploring, hopping from the couch to a nearby chair with the ease of a cat who felt entirely at home. Sarah, on the other hand, wasn't sure where to begin. Henry watched her from the doorway of the kitchen, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He wasn't used to this, to having someone else in his carefully ordered world. Yet, as he observed her, there was something about the way she stood there, both cautious and resolute, that made him feel a flicker of reassurance. "Make yourself comfortable," he said, his voice low but sincere. Sarah nodded but didn't move. She wasn't sure what comfortable meant in a place like this. The couch looked too pristine to sit on, the glass coffee table too fragile to set anything on. It was a far cry from the streets, where she was used to making do with whatever space she could find. But here, she felt like an intruder, an uninvited guest in a museum-like home. Henry stepped forward, sensing her hesitation. "You're safe here," he added, the words coming out softer this time. Sarah glanced at him, her eyes briefly meeting his before darting away. She wanted to believe him, but trust wasn't something that came easily anymore. Jasper meowed from the couch, as if urging her to relax. Eventually, Sarah took a seat on the edge of the couch, still clutching the blanket tightly around her shoulders. Henry returned to the kitchen, busying himself with small tasks to fill the silence. He pulled out 2 mugs and began brewing tea, the warm aroma slowly filling the room. As he waited for the water to boil, he glanced over his shoulder at Sarah, who was absently stroking Jasper's fur. The tea was ready, and Henry set a steaming mug in front of her. "I wasn't sure what you liked," he admitted, sitting across from her. Sarah smiled faintly, her hands wrapping around the mug to soak up its warmth. "This is perfect," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, the tension between them eased, replaced by a shared sense of quiet understanding. Sarah's gaze drifted to her violin case. It had been her lifeline for so long, the one thing that gave her purpose and kept her grounded. Henry noticed her looking at it and asked, "Do you always keep it with you?" Sarah nodded. "I have to. It's all I have." Her voice carried a mix of pride and vulnerability that caught Henry off guard. "You should play sometime," he suggested, the words surprising even himself. Sarah glanced up at him, her expression a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. "Maybe," she said, not ready to commit. But something in his tone made her believe he genuinely wanted to hear her music, not out of pity but out of respect. As the evening wore on, Sarah began to relax, even if just slightly. Henry, too, felt the rigidity in his shoulders start to fade. For the first time, his apartment didn't feel like just a place to live. It felt like a space where something meaningful could grow. Jasper curled up between them, purring softly, as if to seal the unspoken truce forming between them. Later that night, Henry showed Sarah to the guest room. "You can stay as long as you need," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty he felt. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a gratitude she couldn't put into words. "Thank you," she replied, stepping into the room with Jasper at her heels. As Henry walked back to the living room, he couldn't help but feel that this small act of kindness might be the beginning of something much bigger. The days began to settle into a fragile rhythm. Sarah stayed quiet, careful not to disturb Henry's structured world, while Jasper roamed the apartment like he owned it. Henry, for his part, found himself adjusting to their presence, though the change felt strange. He'd never imagined sharing his space with anyone, let alone a young violinist and her ever-curious cat. Henry returned from work one evening to the sound of music. Sarah had begun to play her violin again, though only when she thought he wasn't listening. The melodies floated through the apartment, soft yet powerful, carrying emotions that words could never express. Henry paused in the hallway, the music stirring something deep within him. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, feeling the walls of his solitude begin to shift. But the calm was soon disrupted by the arrival of Claire, one of Henry's high-profile clients. Known for her bluntness and sharp tongue, Claire was not the type to mince words. She arrived unannounced, stepping into the apartment with her usual air of authority. The moment she saw Sarah, her eyebrows shot up in surprise. "And who is this?" she asked, her tone more accusatory than curious. Henry hesitated, caught off guard. "This is Sarah," he said simply, unsure of how to explain her presence. Claire's gaze flicked between Sarah and Henry, her expression growing colder. "I see," she said, her voice dripping with skepticism. "And what exactly is she doing here?" Sarah, sitting on the couch with Jasper in her lap, felt the weight of the question pressing down on her. Claire didn't stop there. "You're a kind man, Henry, but you should be careful. People can take advantage of generosity, especially someone in her position." Her words hung in the air like a blade. Sarah's face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation, but she stayed silent, her fingers gripping the edge of the couch. Henry shifted uncomfortably, torn between defending Sarah and maintaining his professional composure. After Claire left, the tension lingered. Henry replayed her words in his mind, doubts beginning to creep in. He didn't want to believe them, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. Why had Sarah never told him much about her past? Why had she ended up on the streets in the first place? His thoughts swirled, and he found himself retreating into the analytical mindset that had always been his refuge. Sarah noticed the change in Henry immediately. His glances were shorter, his tone less warm. She felt the distance growing, and it stung more than she wanted to admit. Jasper, sensing the unease, stayed close to her, as if offering silent comfort. Sarah began to wonder if she should leave before things grew worse. She didn't want to be where she wasn't wanted. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing day. Henry wanted to ask Sarah more about her life, to fill in the gaps that fed his doubts, but he didn't know how to approach her without sounding accusatory. Sarah, on the other hand, felt trapped, unsure if she could share her story without losing the fragile connection they had built. One evening, Sarah played her violin with more intensity than ever before. The notes were raw and haunting, speaking of pain and resilience in a way that made Henry stop in his tracks. He stood in the doorway, listening, the music tugging at the part of him that knew Claire's words weren't the whole truth. But his own fears and insecurities kept him frozen, unable to reach out. Jasper, as always, was the first to break the tension. The cat padded over to Henry and nudged his leg, as if urging him to act. Henry bent down, stroking Jasper's fur absent-mindedly as he watched Sarah finish her piece. The moment the last note faded, she lowered her violin and looked at him, her eyes searching for something, an answer, an apology, or maybe just a sign that he still believed in her. Henry sat at the edge of the couch, Jasper curled beside him, as the echoes of Sarah's violin hung in the air. The music had spoken volumes, yet he still felt the weight of his doubts pressing against his chest. He couldn't ignore Claire's warnings or the gaps in Sarah's story, but neither could he dismiss the raw emotion in her playing. The conflict inside him was growing unbearable. Sarah, sensing Henry's turmoil, retreated to her room and began packing her few belongings. She didn't want to be a burden, nor did she want to stay where she wasn't fully welcome. Jasper padded into the room, watching her with wide eyes as she zipped her bag and carefully placed her violin inside. Her movements were quick, almost mechanical, as if leaving was her only option. Henry, still seated in the living room, replayed every conversation he'd had with Sarah since the night he met her. He had opened his home to her without question, but now those questions were all-consuming. Why had she ended up on the streets? Why did she cling to her violin so fiercely? He didn't realize how long he had been lost in thought until he heard the faint sound of footsteps. When Sarah appeared in the doorway with her bag slung over her shoulder and Jasper cradled in her arms, Henry stood abruptly. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Sarah froze, her expression a mix of defiance and pain. "I'm leaving," she said simply. "It's clear I don't belong here." Henry ran a hand through his hair, struggling to find the right words. "I didn't ask you to leave," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "No, but you didn't have to. I can see it in the way you look at me now. You don't trust me." Her words cut deep, exposing the very doubt Henry had been trying to bury. "You haven't told me anything," he countered, his frustration boiling over. "I don't know why you're here, why you need help. How can I trust someone who keeps everything a secret?" Sarah took a step back, as if his words were a physical blow. "Because trusting people got me here," she shot back, her voice trembling. "Because every time I trusted someone, they let me down. So excuse me if I don't feel like pouring my soul out to you." The room fell silent, the tension between them crackling like a live wire. Henry wanted to say something, to bridge the gap he had just widened, but the words wouldn't come. Sarah turned and walked toward the door, her grip tightening on Jasper. Henry took a step forward, his hand outstretched, but he stopped himself. As the door closed behind her, the apartment felt emptier than ever. Henry sank back onto the couch, his head in his hands. The doubts that had driven her away now felt hollow, replaced by the ache of her absence. Jasper's empty bed in the corner was a painful reminder of what he had just lost. Outside, Sarah walked briskly through the cold night, the wind biting at her face. She held Jasper close, trying to shield him from the chill. Her heart was heavy, but she kept moving. She had survived alone before, and she would do it again. Yet, as she glanced down at Jasper, a tear slid down her cheek. This time, it felt harder. Back in the apartment, Henry paced the room, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of Sarah standing in the doorway, her words laced with both truth and pain. He realized that her silence wasn't deception, it was protection. She wasn't hiding from him, she was hiding from the world that had hurt her. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. Grabbing his coat, Henry bolted out the door. He didn't know where Sarah might have gone, but he couldn't let her walk away without trying to fix what he had broken. The night was cold, the streets unfamiliar, but he was determined. He had made a mistake, and now he had to make it right, no matter what it took. Sarah trudged through the dimly lit streets, clutching Jasper tightly against her chest to shield him from the biting wind. Each step felt heavier than the last, her legs aching from exhaustion and her heart weighed down by the events of the evening. She had left Henry's apartment not because she wanted to, but because she felt she had no other choice. Trust had always been a fragile thing for her, and Henry's doubts had shattered what little she had managed to build. She found herself at the edge of a small park, one she'd visited many times before. It was a place of fleeting solace, where she could sit unnoticed, blending into the shadows. Sarah settled onto a cold, worn bench, carefully setting her violin case beside her. Jasper snuggled closer, his soft purring the only comfort she had left. As the minutes passed, Sarah opened her violin case and withdrew the instrument. Her fingers, numb from the cold, trembled as she positioned the bow against the strings. She began to play, not for an audience, not for survival, but for herself. The music poured out of her like a confession, raw and unfiltered, carrying the pain of her past and the uncertainty of her future. The haunting melody echoed through the empty park, catching the attention of a few passers-by who stopped to listen. Sarah didn't notice them. Her eyes were closed, her focus entirely on the notes she drew from her violin. It was as though the instrument was an extension of her soul, translating emotions too complex for words into something beautiful. Meanwhile, Henry was driving aimlessly through the city, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of Sarah standing in his doorway, her face a mixture of hurt and defiance. Her words replayed in his mind, over and over, because trusting people got me here. He realized now that her guardedness wasn't a sign of deceit, it was a shield she had built to survive. As he turned down another street, he saw the park and instinctively slowed his car. Something drew him to it, an inexplicable pull he couldn't ignore. Parking on the curb, he stepped out into the cold night, his breath visible in the crisp air. He hadn't taken more than a few steps when he heard the music. The sound was unmistakable, Sarah's violin. Henry followed the melody, his pace quickening as he moved deeper into the park. When he finally saw her, sitting on the bench with Jasper at her feet and the violin in her hands, he stopped. She looked so small, so fragile against the backdrop of the empty park, yet her music carried an undeniable strength. Sarah's song came to an end, the final note lingering in the air like a whisper. She lowered the violin and opened her eyes, startled to find Henry standing a few feet away. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice cautious but not unkind. Henry stepped closer, his breath hitching as he searched for the right words. "I came to apologize," he said, his tone earnest. "I was wrong, Sarah. I let my own fears get in the way, and I doubted you when I shouldn't have. You don't owe me anything, but I want to make this right." Sarah's grip on the violin tightened as she studied his face, searching for any trace of insincerity. She found none. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jasper, sensing the tension, padded over to Henry and rubbed against his leg. Henry glanced down at the cat, then back at Sarah. "You don't have to trust me completely," he said softly, "but at least let me try to earn it back." Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she nodded, her voice catching as she whispered. Together, they began the walk back to Henry's apartment, the cold air biting but no longer unbearable. Henry carried her violin case while Sarah cradled Jasper, and though no words were exchanged, a sense of understanding passed between them. It wasn't a resolution, it was a beginning. The apartment felt warmer when they returned, though nothing about its temperature had changed. Sarah hesitated in the doorway, her violin case in one hand and Jasper tucked safely in the crook of her arm. Henry stepped aside, giving her space, as if to show that she could leave if she wanted to. But she didn't. Instead, she took a deep breath and crossed the threshold. Henry set her violin case gently on the coffee table and gestured toward the couch. "Sit. Let me make some tea," he offered, his voice softer than before. Sarah nodded, her exhaustion evident. Jasper jumped from her arms and padded over to his favorite spot on the couch, curling up as if no time had passed since they'd left. While Henry busied himself in the kitchen, Sarah glanced around the apartment. It looked the same, but she noticed small details she had overlooked before. The way the books on the shelves were meticulously arranged, the faint scent of cedarwood from a candle on the counter. For the first time, it felt less like a museum and more like a home she wasn't sure she deserved. When Henry returned with 2 mugs of tea, he set them on the table and sat across from her. "I want to know your story," he said gently, meeting her gaze. Sarah stiffened at first, but there was no judgment in his voice, only curiosity and something else she couldn't quite name. Trust, maybe? She hesitated, unsure of how much to share. "It's not a pretty story," she began, her fingers curling around the warm mug. Henry didn't interrupt, letting her speak at her own pace. She told him about the years of struggle, the abusive relationship that had stolen her sense of safety, and the day she found herself with nothing but her violin and Jasper. Her voice wavered at times, but she didn't stop, and Henry listened intently, his expression never shifting from one of quiet empathy. When she finished, Sarah felt lighter, though her chest still ached with vulnerability. Henry leaned back, processing everything she had said. "You've been through so much," he said finally, "but you're still here. That takes strength." Sarah blinked, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to hearing her survival framed as a triumph. Henry reached for her violin case and opened it, revealing the instrument that had been her constant companion. "This violin saved you," he said, his fingers brushing the strings gently. "But I think you saved yourself too. Maybe it's time you let the world hear what you have to say." Sarah's breath caught. She had never thought of her music as anything more than a lifeline, but the way Henry spoke made it sound like it could be something greater. "Where would I even start?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry smiled, a small but genuine curve of his lips. "We start here. Together. One step at a time." Sarah stared at him, a flicker of hope igniting in her chest. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future, one where her music was more than just a survival tool. That night, as Sarah played her violin in the living room, the sound carried a new energy, less sorrow, more determination. Henry sat nearby, Jasper sprawled across his lap, the three of them forming an unlikely but unshakable bond. The music filled the apartment, wrapping around them like a promise. In the quiet moments that followed, Henry looked at Sarah and said, "I don't know where this journey will take us, but I do know one thing. You're not alone anymore." Sarah's fingers tightened around the bow, and she nodded, tears shimmering in her eyes. For the first time in a long while, she believed him. The days that followed were a quiet yet transformative period for both Sarah and Henry. The once sterile apartment began to reflect the life they were building together. Sarah's violin found a place of honor near the window, where sunlight illuminated its polished wood. Jasper claimed every soft surface as his own, leaving tufts of fur as proof of his presence. For the first time, Henry didn't mind the mess. Sarah started practicing her violin more often, and Henry would pause his work to listen. The melodies that filled the apartment carried a new kind of energy, hopeful and strong. Henry found himself looking forward to these moments, the music reminding him of what life could feel like beyond his meticulously planned existence. Sarah's confidence grew, though she still approached each day with caution, as if waiting for the ground to give way beneath her. One afternoon, Henry came home with a flyer he had found at a local cafe. It advertised a talent showcase at a nearby music hall, open to musicians of all levels. He placed it on the table where Sarah could see it and waited for her reaction. "You think I should do this?" she asked, her voice filled with equal parts curiosity and doubt. "I think people need to hear your music," Henry said, his tone steady. "And I think you need to believe that you're ready to be heard." Sarah hesitated, glancing at the flyer. The idea of performing in front of a crowd terrified her, but something in Henry's words gave her pause. He wasn't just encouraging her, he genuinely believed in her. After a long moment, Sarah picked up the flyer. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll try." Henry smiled, a rare expression that softened his usually serious face. "That's all I'm asking," he replied. Jasper meowed in approval, as if sealing the decision. In the weeks leading up to the showcase, Sarah poured herself into preparation. Henry offered support in every way he could, whether it was by rearranging his schedule to give her uninterrupted practice time or simply listening when her nerves got the better of her. Slowly but surely, Sarah began to feel a sense of purpose that had long been buried. The day of the showcase arrived, and the atmosphere in the apartment was a mix of excitement and tension. Sarah paced the living room, her violin in hand, while Jasper watched from the couch. Henry, dressed in a tailored jacket, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've got this," he said. "Just remember why you started playing in the first place." The music hall buzzed with anticipation as performers took the stage one by one. When Sarah's name was called, her hands trembled as she walked out under the spotlight. The audience quieted, their attention drawn to the petite young woman standing alone with her violin. Henry sat in the crowd, his heart pounding in time with hers. Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. As the bow touched the strings, the first note rang out, pure and unwavering. The music that followed was unlike anything she had ever played before. It was her story, told without words, a journey of pain, resilience, and hope. The audience was spellbound, their applause thunderous when she finished. Backstage, Henry was waiting for her, his expression filled with pride. Sarah approached him slowly, unsure of what to say. Before she could speak, he pulled her into a brief but heartfelt hug. "You were incredible," he said, his voice low but firm. Sarah smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. For the first time, she felt like she was more than her struggles. She was her strength. The applause from Sarah's performance still echoed in her ears as she and Henry walked back to the apartment. The air between them was lighter, almost celebratory, though neither of them spoke much. Jasper greeted them at the door, weaving between their legs as if sensing the shift in their energy. Sarah set her violin case down gently, still marveling at what had just happened. "You've changed this place," Henry said suddenly, breaking the silence. Sarah looked up at him, surprised. He gestured around the apartment, which now felt alive in a way it never had before. "It's not just the music. It's you, and Jasper too, of course." His tone was light, but his words carried weight. Sarah smiled, a small but genuine expression of gratitude. The following days were filled with an unexpected sense of ease. Sarah's confidence grew, bolstered by the success of her performance and the unwavering support Henry provided. She started composing her own music, filling the apartment with new melodies that reflected not just her past struggles but the hope she now felt for the future. Henry often found himself pausing his work just to listen, letting her music remind him of how far they'd both come. But the journey wasn't without its challenges. Sarah still battled moments of self-doubt, flashes of her old fears creeping in when she least expected them. One evening, after a particularly difficult practice session, she put down her violin and sighed. "What if this is as far as I get?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. Henry sat down across from her, his gaze steady. "It's not," he said simply. "You're just getting started." Sarah looked at him, the sincerity in his voice cutting through her doubt. She nodded slowly, a spark of determination reigniting within her. Henry, too, was undergoing a quiet transformation. He began to realize that his life, once so structured and solitary, was better with Sarah and Jasper in it. His apartment, which had once felt like a fortress, now felt like a home. He found himself laughing more, opening up in ways he hadn't in years. For the first time, he wasn't just living, he was connecting. One day, Sarah received an email inviting her to perform at a renowned music festival. The invitation was unexpected and overwhelming, but Henry's excitement was infectious. "This is your chance," he said, practically beaming. Sarah hesitated, the weight of the opportunity almost paralyzing her. But when she looked at Henry, she saw not just encouragement but faith. The night of the festival arrived, and Sarah stood backstage, clutching her violin tightly. The sound of the crowd beyond the curtain was daunting, but she took a deep breath and thought of everything she had overcome to get there. When her name was announced, she stepped onto the stage with her head held high. The performance was a triumph. Sarah poured her heart into every note, her music weaving a story that left the audience spellbound. When the final note faded and the applause erupted, she felt a wave of emotion she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just pride, it was a sense of belonging, of finally stepping into the life she was meant to live. Backstage, Henry was waiting with Jasper tucked discreetly in a bag. He didn't say much, but the look on his face said everything. "You did it," he finally said, his voice steady and full of pride. Sarah smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "We did it," she corrected, her voice filled with gratitude. That night, as they sat together in the apartment, the future no longer felt uncertain. Sarah played a quiet melody on her violin while Henry leaned back on the couch, Jasper purring softly at his side. The three of them, bound by their shared journey, had found not just a home but a family. Life in the apartment had settled into something Sarah never imagined, a rhythm of warmth, creativity, and connection. The once silent space was now filled with melodies that spilled from her violin, laughter shared between her and Henry, and the occasional crash as Jasper knocked over yet another decoration. The walls, which had once seemed cold and impersonal, now felt alive, reflecting the transformation they had all undergone. Sarah's name was slowly gaining recognition in the local music scene. Invitations to perform became more frequent, and with each new stage, she grew more confident. But it wasn't just the applause or accolades that mattered to her, it was the sense of purpose she felt every time she picked up her violin. Her music was no longer just a survival tool, it was a testament to her resilience and growth. Henry, too, had changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. His work as an architect remained successful, but it no longer consumed him. He found joy in small things, experimenting with cooking, attending Sarah's performances, even just watching Jasper play. For the first time in years, he felt present in his own life. One evening, Henry came home with a small package in hand. "What's that?" Sarah asked, looking up from her composition. Henry set the package on the table and motioned for her to open it. Inside was a sleek new violin case, carefully crafted and elegant. "You've outgrown the old one," he said simply. Sarah's eyes welled with tears as she ran her fingers over the smooth surface. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The gesture wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. It marked the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. Sarah's old violin case, battered but beloved, had carried her through the hardest moments of her life. But now, with Henry and Jasper by her side, she was ready to move forward, equipped with new tools and a stronger sense of self. When Sarah performed at a prestigious city event a few weeks later, the applause was deafening. She stood under the bright stage lights, her heart full as she bowed to the audience. Among the crowd, Henry sat quietly, Jasper tucked discreetly in a carrier by his side. His pride in Sarah was immeasurable, but more than that, he was grateful for how she had changed his life. Back at the apartment that night, they celebrated with takeout and laughter, Jasper eagerly trying to sneak a bite of their food. Sarah leaned her violin against the wall, the polished wood catching the light. "I don't think I ever thanked you properly," she said, looking at Henry. "Not just for the case, for everything." Henry shrugged, though his eyes were soft. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "You've done more for me than you realize." Sarah tilted her head, curious. "What do you mean?" Henry smiled, a rare and genuine expression. "You brought life back to this place. To me. I didn't even know I needed it." The two of them sat in companionable silence, Jasper weaving between their legs before curling up on Sarah's lap. The journey that had begun with a chance encounter on a cold night had brought them to a place neither of them could have imagined. They had both been lost, but together, they had found their way back, not just to each other, but to themselves. As Sarah picked up her violin and began to play a soft, hopeful melody, Henry leaned back on the couch, his eyes closing as he let the music wash over him. Jasper purred in time with the notes, the sound filling the room like a heartbeat. It wasn't just a happy ending, it was a new beginning, one built on trust, resilience, and the unshakable bond they had created.